Welcome to Sheffield, the Steel City. One of the great crucibles of Britain's Industrial Revolution, a cradle of English sporting heritage, and today one of Yorkshire's most bustling metropolises, Sheffield is a place that combines its illustrious history and wealth of striking architecture with a diverse and welcoming community to stand as one of Britain's best cities. With the people of Sheffield out in full force on this gloriously sunny afternoon, we'll get a flavour for the city as we take a tour of its busy city centre, passing by landmarks old and new that will give us a window into the enthralling story of Sheffield. But we start right at the heart of the city, in front of Sheffield Town Hall and its gorgeous Peace Gardens, which are buzzing with activity today. The sprawling Town Hall is one of Sheffield's most iconic Victorian landmarks, built over 7 years in the late 19th century and completed in 1897. Built on a grand scale and opened by none other than Queen Victoria herself, this town hall is actually the fourth to have existed in Sheffield, its size indicative of the prosperity that Sheffield experienced as it went from strength to strength during the industrial era. Historically, this town hall was neighboured by a large 18th century church, known as St Paul's Church, but this historic place of worship was demolished in 1938 and replaced by the spacious Peace Gardens, so called as their opening coincided with the signing of the Munich Agreement, the infamous treaty that involved the United Kingdom and Nazi Germany, and was briefly thought to have prevented war in Europe. While peace in Europe didn't last long in that case, the Peace Gardens have endured through the decades, remaining a favourite spot for Sheffielders to relax on gorgeous days like today. Of course, these exquisite gardens, complete with fountains galore, were once the site of the old St Paul's Church, historically one of Sheffield's central churches, but which was only demolished when the area surrounding us here, which had predominantly developed as a large area of slums, were cleared, and the local congregation therefore effectively disappeared. Nowadays, this wide-open part of the city is typically the heart of most major events in Sheffield, with the town hall above us here serving as both the home of Sheffield City Council and a number of historic exhibitions detailing the city's heritage. But one odd part of the history of this building can be found in its clock tower that we can see up above. Despite being built in the 1890s, the town hall's clock tower is still effectively unfinished, as it was originally completed without a bell inside to ring on the hour. The reason for this is that the local Sheffield Corporation expected that someone would donate the money for the bells, but nobody ever did, and so the clock was silent for well over a century. Nowadays though, you will hear the clock tower chime every hour, but there are still no bells inside, the sound instead made by an electronic recording that was installed back in 2002. Coincidentally though, outside a local watchmaker's just opposite the town hall on this plaza, there is a noisy local timepiece that has been sounding for long before the town hall was even built. A small plaque above H.L. Brown Watchmakers denotes the site of the 1 o'clock Siren, which sounds every day at 1 o'clock in Sheffield, and has done so ever since 1874, said to have served as an important timekeeping device that many local factories used to mark the end of their workers' lunch breaks, and which remained especially useful after the town hall's clock tower was left without bells for more than a century. Now, we're going to make our way away from the town hall by walking along Fargate, one of the city's main shopping streets. Fargate takes its name from the fact that it was the street, or gate, deriving from a Scandinavian word for street, that led far away from the centre of Old Sheffield, which was historically focused around the historic Sheffield Castle and Marketplace, a couple of blocks from where we are now. Once on the peripheries of the old town, Fargate is today lined by a mishmash of 20th century behemoths and a smattering of Victorian edifices, like these buildings of the early 1880s on our left, that now play host to a popular high street newsagents, but which were originally the home of Arthur Davy's famous Grocers, said to have been the largest of its kind in the country at the time, and which operated under the name Davy's as a famous Sheffield institution until 1972. But while many marvel at some of the grand buildings alongside Fargate, the ground that we're walking on too is full of history. It's thought that Fargate was built over the site of medieval mass graves, which, as we mentioned, would have been positioned on the edge of what was then the relatively small settlement of Sheffield at the time. In fact, for much of its history, Sheffield was a modestly sized town that spanned only the area between Sheffield Castle and Sheffield Cathedral, which we'll find at the end of Fargate here. By contrast, the city today is home to over 500,000 people, and ranks among the 10 largest cities in the United Kingdom, with an urban sprawl that expands far beyond the historic streets that we'll find in the centre of Sheffield today. Later on, we'll talk more about how Sheffield grew from modest medieval town to major city, but here we've reached the point where Fargate meets the High Street, a place locally known by the name Cole's Corner, after the old Cole Brothers department store that existed from the mid-19th century until the 1960s. Cole's Corner was historically a popular meeting spot for people in Sheffield, although the old department store later relocated a short distance away to Barker's Pool, where it continued to operate until 2002. Just opposite Cole's Corner, however, there stands one of the oldest and most important buildings in the city, Sheffield Cathedral. Now, as we just pointed out, this was once upon a time the edge of the small settlement of medieval Sheffield, with the grand church before us here dating back to the 13th century at its oldest, making the cathedral the oldest active building in Sheffield. Even so, the site on which the cathedral stands has an even longer religious history, as around 1200 years ago in the 9th century, there stood a Saxon-era cross that possibly marked the site of a place of worship. The cross, which still exists in part today and is on display in the British Museum down in London, is one of the best preserved of its era in the country. However, while it's now gone from this point in Sheffield, the cathedral that took its place today stands as an icon of the city, combining modern architecture, like the lantern tower on our left that was added to the cathedral in 1966, and centuries-old building work, with the spire and central tower dating from around 1430, while even older Norman-era stonework can also be found peppered around the church walls. Expanded and rebuilt in places over the course of nearly 800 years, what was once Sheffield's humble parish church has grown in size and stature alongside the city that swelled around it, with the church gaining the status of a cathedral back in 1914. Since gaining that status, Sheffield Cathedral has had a dramatic century or so, having suffered damage in the Second World War during the devastating Sheffield Blitz, although escaping relatively unscathed compared with the rest of the city, while in 1979 and 2020, heavier damage was caused by fires that affected the bell tower, the cathedral's stained glass windows, and sadly destroyed a number of rooms inside too. But as we walk out of the cathedral grounds, despite all that, Sheffield Cathedral remains an important point in the modern city, even for those who don't use it for worship. Just outside the cathedral here on the busy Church Street, we can see tram tracks running along the road, with all 4 lines of Sheffield's most famous form of public transport serving the cathedral stop here. Sheffield's long association with trams dates back to 1873, although the original tram network was closed down in 1960, only to be revived in 1994 under its current name, Sheffield Supertram. Supertrams pass straight by many of Sheffield's most famous landmarks, such as the beautiful Telegraph and Star building of 1916 that towers above us here on the High Street, having historically played home to the Sheffield Star daily newspaper and the Sheffield Telegraph weekly newspaper, which have been published in the city since the mid to late 19th century. Today nicely restored after the newspaper moved out of the building in the mid-20th century, the old Telegraph and Star building marks the start of the historic High Street that links the cathedral with the site of the old Sheffield Castle, which once stood just a few hundred yards away from where we are now. Now, much like Fargate, the High Street today appears to be a rather modern road, lined with both tram tracks and huge 19th and 20th century buildings. But of course, given the city's lengthy history, Sheffield's High Street has been around for as long as people have lived here. For a long time, however, the High Street here was officially known by a different name, Priorgate, so named after the Prior of Worksop, who likely owned a number of houses beside the main road through central Sheffield at the time, when this area was heavily influenced by the then more religiously significant settlement at Worksop. At that time, the High Street was of course much narrower than it is today, typical of a medieval Yorkshire town, but it was still a lively place, with Sheffield known as an important regional market town, where farmers would come to sell their crops and livestock from the surrounding area, and where many other goods produced in mills on the rivers Sheaf, Don and Loxley were sold. In fact, the presence of no less than 3 fast-flowing rivers surrounding medieval Sheffield was a crucial part of the town's rise to prominence in the region, with mills powered by the river's flow producing typical goods such as corn and grain, and most notably, knives and cutlery. For centuries, Sheffield was known as Northern England's premier hub of cutlery production. The reason for this was that as well as having rivers to power its mills, the hills surrounding Sheffield were rich in raw materials used to build strong grindstones that were then employed to sharpen and round off pieces of cutlery. As such, the sale of cutlery was a big draw for those coming to Sheffield's markets, a number of which existed all over the town, but the biggest of which historically took place just here, on what was once the marketplace, and what is today known as Crucible Square. Though nowadays a fairly chaotic road and tram junction, this place was once the beating heart of trade in Sheffield, with markets held at this point in the medieval town from the year 1296 all the way until 1930, when the Fitzalan Market Hall, which stood just to our left, was closed down. We'll return to Crucible Square shortly, but we're now on Angel Street, beside the site of what was once the mighty Sheffield Castle, where there now stands the building known as Castle House, built in 1962, and which is complete with an ominous sculpture of Vulcan, the Roman god of fire and a symbol of the industrial city of Sheffield. Meanwhile, Castle House, named in a nod to the fortress that once occupied its site, is also home to the National Videogame Museum, which originally opened in Nottingham in 2015, but moved here to Sheffield in 2018, and claims to be the world's first cultural centre entirely dedicated to video games. As we can see around us, Angel Street is an area which has undergone significant development over the last half-century or so, and is still being worked on today. Originally, however, Angel Street was the site of a famous local hotel, the Angel Hotel, built back in 1657, and once upon a time one of the most popular places to stay for travellers in Sheffield. Sadly, the historic Angel Hotel was destroyed in 1940 during the Sheffield Blitz, a devastating Luftwaffe bombing campaign of the Second World War that reduced much of the city centre to rubble over the course of 4 December days. The Sheffield Blitz was intended to cripple the city's sprawling industry and its steel factories in particular, although it was largely a failure, as most factories continued to operate. However, civilians suffered heavily, with more than 660 people killed, over 3,000 houses destroyed, more than 40,000 Sheffielders left homeless, and huge chunks taken out of the historic city centre. Fortunately, a number of pre-war landmarks survived the Blitz, such as the building we're passing now, Sheffield's Old Town Hall, built in 1808 to replace a much smaller town hall that stood near to the cathedral. This town hall was specifically designed to have room for expansion given the fast growth of Sheffield in the early 19th century, the city's population rising by more than 100,000 between 1801 and 1851. However, as we know, the Old Town Hall didn't last long as Sheffield's main civic building, replaced in 1897 by the behemoth where we started our walk, which was built at a time when the city's population had skyrocketed to over 400,000 people. Sheffield's population grew at a frankly ludicrous pace during the 19th century, causing the city to swell far beyond the small scope of the original medieval town around the castle and cathedral. But here we're walking up Haymarket, which roughly follows the western wall of what was once the mighty Sheffield Castle. The castle, which once stood just to our left, historically dominated the medieval town, originally built as a small wooden fortress in the 12th century, and then rebuilt in the year 1270 as a much stronger stone castle, strategically positioned beside the point where the rivers Sheaf and Don meet, giving the castle a natural moat on 2 sides. In places like where we're walking now, where there were no rivers to defend the castle, large walls were built, crucial for keeping attackers out and for keeping prisoners in. Back in the late 16th century, Sheffield Castle was home to a notable prisoner in the form of Mary Queen of Scots, who was held in the castle and its associated estates over a period of 14 years under the orders of Queen Elizabeth I, who was suspicious of the Catholic Scottish Queen and her possible desire to take the English throne. At its greatest extent, Sheffield Castle's grounds reached all the way from the River Don to this point, today Fitzalan Square, named after the Fitzalan Market Hall that once stood just up the road from here. Today, Fitzalan Square is home to this statue of King Edward VII, erected where a small clock tower once stood in 1913 during a period of development for the square. Now Fitzalan Square, despite its namesake market hall actually having stood on the marketplace a few steps away, was also a part of Sheffield's historic trading sphere, with the city's swine market stretching down from the marketplace to this point. The square as we know it today was laid out in 1881, when the old Market Street and a number of buildings that stood here were demolished, replaced not only by the open plaza, but later by a number of majestic buildings, the most famous of which stands before us here. This is Sheffield's old General Post Office, opened in 1910 as Fitzalan Square was being renovated, and which operated as the head post office for Sheffield right up until 1999. Weirdly, however, while the building looks big enough from this perspective, it's actually much larger than what we can see, the greatest portion of the building extending beneath the level of Fitzalan Square, as it was built on a steep hillside here on the edge of central Sheffield. After the post office closed in 1999, it was left empty for a number of years, though since 2016, it's been a part of Sheffield Hallam University's Institute of Arts, complete with a gallery that's open to the public during exhibitions. The old General Post Office is also rather lucky to still be standing today, as just across Fitzalan Square, there once stood a Victorian-era hotel locally known as the Marples, which was destroyed on the first night of the Sheffield Blitz, when German bombers, intending to attack the city's factories but suffering with navigation issues, accidentally dropped a huge payload of bombs onto the city centre, the Marples Hotel being obliterated by the raid, while 70 people hiding in its basement were sadly killed. Passing by the historic marketplace, today Castle Square once again, the Sheffield Blitz wasn't the only time that this city found itself in the crosshairs of a major military conflict. As we know, the old Sheffield Castle no longer dominates the city as it once did. But where did it go? Well, like many once powerful castles across Yorkshire, Sheffield Castle fell victim to the events of the English Civil War. Though initially starting out under the control of the parliamentarians, Sheffield Castle was taken by royalist armies in 1643, as the forces of King Charles I came to dominate Yorkshire in the early stages of the war. However, a year later, as things went from bad to worse for the king, Sheffield and its castle fell to the parliamentarians. Given the historic strength and reputation of Sheffield Castle, Parliament ordered its demolition in 1646, although just 3 years later, it was bought by the wealthy Earl of Arundel, who initially sought to restore it, but never started owing to the heavy damage. Soon after, the castle was destroyed entirely, eventually being built over by the towering modern buildings that define Sheffield city centre today. Walking along Arundel Gate, we'll now make our way across the road up towards the exquisite Tudor Square, the home of the famous Graves Gallery, the sparkling Winter Gardens, and the world-famous Crucible Theatre, the home of the World Snooker Championship. Now the Crucible, as well as famously hosting snooker's most prestigious championship, also takes its name from crucible steel, famously associated with the city of Sheffield during the Industrial Revolution. Later on, we'll talk more about how heavy industry developed in Sheffield, and how the city came to be known as the Steel City. But as we wait to cross Arundel Gate here, what's the story behind the name Sheffield itself? Well, despite originating from Old English over 1,000 years ago, the name Sheffield very simply refers to a field or clearing by the River Sheaf, exactly where the city is located today. But there's more to the name than that, as the River Sheaf is actually thought to take its name from an Old English word for a border or dividing line, most likely between Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, regions that still have an influence on the way we see England today. People often talk of where the line that marks the famous north-south divide in England lies, and it's reasonable to say that Sheffield lies right on that cultural border. But there's more to the north-south divide than people who say grass and others who say grass, as the River Sheaf for centuries acted as a significant border, first between the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of Northumbria, of which Sheffield was a part, and the Kingdom of Mercia, today home to places like Birmingham and the wider Midlands. As we pass by the Grand Victoria Hall, a large Methodist church opened in 1908, the River Sheaf continued to form the border between what became the counties of Yorkshire and Derbyshire, all the way until 1974, when parts of the Sheffield area were absorbed into the modern county of Derbyshire. But owing to its long history on the borderlands, there's a strong case to say that this city is the point where northern England truly begins. Certainly, Sheffield is an integral part of the historic county of Yorkshire, standing as the county's second largest city by metropolitan population, behind Leeds about 40 miles to the north. Meanwhile, in the modern ceremonial county of South Yorkshire, created in 1974, Sheffield exists as the central focus for surrounding towns including Rotherham, Barnsley and Doncaster, although all of these places, Sheffield included, were historically a part of the old West Riding of Yorkshire before the county reform. Now, having made our way up Norfolk Street from the site of the old castle, we find ourselves beside Tudor Square, the home of the Crucible and a number of other impressive city landmarks. We'll take a look at the buildings that surround Tudor Square in just a moment, but across the road from the square, we can see another of Sheffield's cathedrals, this being St Marie's Roman Catholic Cathedral, built over 4 years and completed back in 1850. The cathedral certainly appears as one of the oldest buildings in this part of the city, with Tudor Square here home to a range of more modern buildings, the most famous of course being the mighty Crucible Theatre. Opened in 1971 to much fanfare, the Crucible appeared as a particularly futuristic new landmark, built to replace the old Sheffield Playhouse across the city. Designed as a theatre house, the Crucible has become far more well known around the world as the home of the World Snooker Championships, the most prestigious event in the sport of snooker, held here every year since 1977. In fact, while the Crucible Theatre was in its early years derided by some as a bit of a white elephant, its famed association with snooker and the legendary atmosphere inside has turned it into an icon of modern Sheffield, even exceeding the reputation of the historic Lyceum Theatre that stands just beside. Although the theatre that we see today was mostly restored in the late 1980s and early 90s, it has stood on this spot for well over 100 years, ever since 1897, when it was built according to a design by the architect W.G.R. Sprague. Now, Sprague is most famous as a prolific theatre architect of London's West End, with no less than 8 of the playhouses in the capital's theatre district built to his design. But the Lyceum here is the last remaining theatre designed by Sprague that exists outside of London, and with a seating capacity of over 1,000 people, it's the largest theatre in Sheffield today. So, whether it's world-class snooker or a slice of London's West End you're looking for, Sheffield's Tudor Square has it all. But for a long time, this delightful square was little more than a random open space, come car park, in the centre of Sheffield. In fact, it wasn't until 1991 when Sheffield hosted the World Student Games, a kind of Olympics for university students, that this square and many other parts of the city were refurbished and modernised, with Tudor Square now serving as a delightful, modern open space, surrounded not only by famous theatres, but other grand city landmarks. Here on the southern side of Tudor Square, we could see one of the newest landmarks in Sheffield, the glistening Winter Garden, opened in 2003, and which houses thousands of diverse plants inside that, as the name suggests, can survive all year round. Designed with a spectacular glass exterior, Sheffield's Winter Garden is one of a number of city centre glasshouses you'll find around the UK. But this is the largest of its kind in all of Europe, and well worth a visit when you're in the city, particularly on a cold winter's day. Tropical plants on display in the centre of a Yorkshire city are one thing, but just a few steps away from the Winter Garden, and also bordering Tudor Square, is another place full of fantastic exhibitions. This grand building of 1934 is Sheffield's Central Library, the city's largest public library, but which is arguably more famous for the acclaimed Graves Art Gallery that occupies its upper floor, hosting a wide variety of artworks from various historical eras, detailing the development of British and European art over time. So, with two historic theatres in the Crucible and the Lyceum, along with the Graves Art Gallery and the Winter Garden, Tudor Square has in recent years found itself becoming the cultural heart of Sheffield. Although there is another famous cultural venue in the form of Sheffield's Grand City Hall, which we'll now make our way towards. The walk to City Hall should take us around 5 minutes, and take us back past the Grand Town Hall where we started our tour of the city, and which of course encapsulates the prosperity that was brought to the city of Sheffield during the 19th century as local industry skyrocketed. Now, as we know, Sheffield has been a place of industry for centuries, with the historic production of cutlery for a long time serving as one of the main sources of income for people working in the area by the rivers Sheaf and Don. Of course, as well as the presence of rivers to power the mills in which cutlery was made, Sheffield was ideally suited to produce the utensils themselves, owing to the wealth of iron ore in the surrounding landscape. As such, steel production in the form of cutlery was taking place in Sheffield long before it became an industrial titan, and even into the late 20th and early 21st century, the city was still a major producer of cutlery, with the Sheffield-born company Viners having been one of Britain's largest cutlery manufacturers as recently as the 1970s. But when we talk about the Steel City, it's heavy crucible steel that's most famously associated with the city of Sheffield. In the mid-18th century, a clockmaker by the name of Benjamin Huntsman moved to Sheffield, and began developing a revolutionary new way of making higher quality steel on a much larger scale than was historically being produced here. Huntsman's technique involved the use of a crucible, a clay pot inside which iron was melted to searing temperatures of over 1600 degrees, creating molten steel that could have any impurities removed. Though this technique had existed in Asia beforehand, Huntsman was the first to develop it in Europe, and it revolutionized steel production, with the end product being of both a higher quality and able to be produced on a much, much larger scale, the genesis for the industrial city of Sheffield that we know today. Strangely, however, Huntsman's developments in what is now the city suburb of Handsworth were actually initially detrimental to Sheffield's steel industry. Having presented his technique to the town's cutlery producers, he was typically rebuffed, manufacturers considering his steel too hard to shape and grind into knives and forks. So, Huntsman began exporting his steel, made here in Sheffield, to France, where manufacturers there would craft cutlery and then export it back to England. Despite being a rather roundabout trading route, French-produced cutlery with Huntsman steel was a massive success, and it began outselling traditional Sheffield cutlery by leaps and bounds. Within a few years, however, Sheffield cutlers caught on to the new crucible technique, and began developing their production to match the French goods. The impact of Huntsman's technique was evident, as steel production in Sheffield accelerated from a yearly output of around 200 tonnes to over 80,000 tonnes, equivalent to half of all the steel produced in Europe. Developments in steel making only kept coming as the industry made Sheffield ever more prosperous, with the groundbreaking stainless steel also pioneered in the city in the first few years of the 20th century. The rise of Sheffield's steel industry, along with coal mining in a number of surrounding towns, caused the birth of a huge population centre on the southern edge of Yorkshire that remains to this day, a sprawling area of over 1 million people, full of yet more history. One fascinating piece of which is the legacy of association football, many rules of which were devised here in Sheffield, and gave birth to the world's oldest football club, Sheffield FC, along with the modern rivals Sheffield Wednesday and Sheffield United. I wish we had more time to talk about Sheffield's role in the history of football, and so much more, but we've now reached Barker's Pool, where we find the last landmarks on our tour of the city for today. In front of us is the imposing City Hall, opened in 1932 as a huge ornate new events venue, inside which there are a number of halls with a combined seating capacity of over 3,500. The City Hall has played host to performances from everybody from the Beatles to Louis Armstrong and more, but it's also used for civic events such as remembrance services in Sheffield, with the city's towering war memorial here standing just outside the City Hall. Sheffield's War Memorial was unveiled in 1925 in honour of those who lost their lives in the First World War, and the City Hall too was originally set to be named the Memorial Hall in the same vein, although this changed during its construction period. Complete with sculptures of British soldiers around its column, the War Memorial is one of a pair of monuments on this square, which is historically known by the name Barker's Pool, which originates from the fact that centuries ago, it was the place where people would come to collect drinking water from natural springs on what was then the edge of the medieval town of Sheffield. The area around Barker's Pool was then developed into an area of industry and retail in the 19th century, along with much of Sheffield city centre. And on the edge of the square beside the City Hall, there stands a brand new monument dedicated to the city's steel workers during the two world wars. Unveiled in 2016, this statue depicts the Women of Steel, dedicated to the thousands of Sheffield women who took up the mantle and worked in the city's factories during the First and Second World Wars. With thousands of men having gone off to fight in the wars across the world, the people working in Sheffield's factories were crucial to the British war effort on both occasions, with the city serving as a major centre for the manufacture of weaponry during the conflicts, which of course made it a key target for enemy bombing in the Second World War, borne out in the devastating Sheffield Blitz of 1940. But despite the impact of the Blitz and the eventual decline of its legendary steel industry, the City of Steel remains one of the most vibrant cities in Britain today, with a wealth of history to be found in its majestic landmarks or in the places where people lived and worked centuries ago. From the legacy of steel and cutlery to the lingering presence of its once great castle and its historic market, the busy trams that rush about historic streets, and the many modern landmarks that are staking their own claim in the city today, we've just about scratched the surface of Sheffield's illustrious heritage on this gorgeous afternoon. But sadly, we've now reached the end of our tour around the majestic Steel City. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're now looking forward to visiting Sheffield for yourself sometime in future too.